Today's episode is everywhere. It is all around us, even now in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window. Yes, I'm quoting The Matrix here. But it is something that strangely unites Britney Spears and Joni Mitchell.
Hey, farmer, farmer, put away the DDT now. Give me spots on my apples, or leave me the birds and the bees. Please don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Welcome to the new episode of our podcast series, What is Going Wrong and How to Put It Right, where we tell the story of how the EU's zero pollution promises were sabotaged. Sound editing and musical creation by Gui Caligari. I'm Joana Louçã. What is going wrong and how to put it right. If you listen to the EU Watchdog Radio podcast that we do with Counterbalance, you will know because we use it in our opening jingle. But the words Europe's Man on the Moon moment were spoken publicly by Ursula von der Leyen. By the way, if you don't listen to that podcast yet, you should. Anyway, it was December 2019 and von der Leyen was announcing the European Green Deal. 3 months before, the world's largest youth protest had taken place, where young people all over the world took to the streets demanding climate justice. And in the same month as von der Leyen's speech, a then little-known disease called COVID-19 had its first large cluster in Wuhan, China. We know what happened after that. The European Commission stalled and delayed the EU Green Deal's more meaningful measures to do with the use of chemicals and pesticide uses, until they were reduced to almost nothing. How did this happen? To be able to follow Alice down this rabbit hole, we need to know a little bit about the EU Green Deal. It was presented by the European Commission as a set of policies to make the EU climate neutral in 2050. Remember, the Fridays for Future movement was growing all over the world and the climate emergency was becoming more and more mainstream. But apart from the climate target, the Green Deal also dealt with chemicals and toxics. This part of the deal was called EU's Zero Pollution Ambition, which sounded really promising. This zero pollution ambition had two key components, the revision of chemicals regulation and the phase-out of PFAS, the forever chemicals. The part about regulating chemicals was supposed to have included the revision of the flagship REACH regulation. REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals. It is a framework that has existed in the EU for 16 years now, and the Commission was finally revising it as part of a strategy to speed up the removal of hazardous chemicals from consumer products. The second component of the zero pollution ambition was the promise to phase out PFAS, the forever chemicals, which are products that are hard-wearing and persistent and resist degradation. According to the Forever Pollution Project, which maps PFAS pollution across Europe, nearly 23,000 sites over the continent are contaminated with these chemicals, with a particular focus on Central Europe, Denmark, the UK and Switzerland. People in Europe are exposed to alarmingly high levels of chemical substances, linked to cancer, infertility, obesity and asthma, due to being exposed to toxic chemicals. These substances also contribute to the collapse of insect, birds and mammal populations. In light of these toxic pollution and biodiversity crises, regulating hazardous substances is urgent. PFAS are also very much connected to the climate crisis, as fossil fuels are a key feedstock and energy source to the production of chemicals. The EU zero pollution ambition would have meant an end to business as usual for part of the toxic industry, which would necessarily have to stop the production and use of the most harmful chemicals and invest in safer and sustainable chemicals. they would have had to drop the toxic molecules that, while profitable, are endangering communities, ecosystems, and territories. Let's hit pause in this story for 1 minute and have a little break. What is this almighty big toxics lobby that you can already guess we're going to be discussing? Well, the toxic industry, from chemicals to pesticides and parts of energy, is one of the EU's biggest sectors and has grown in the last decade. It is particularly strong in Central Europe and Germany, where BASF and Bayer rule supreme. In our research into the lobbying profiles of these two companies, we dissected their modus operandi in terms of influencing public policy at the highest level. The tight political ties, big lobby budgets, and access to decision-making processes at the European and national levels are very important. Research we published in May last year highlighted how the big toxic lobby, including Bayer, ExxonMobil, Dow Europe, BASF, Cefic, VCI, and Plastics Europe, spent a combined €33.5 million on lobbying the EU institutions. This spending had a clear focus, postponing the REACH revision, pushing back against the ban of forever chemicals, shutting down the proposed cut of pesticide use by 50% until 2030, and dropping the idea of prohibiting the chemicals already banned in the EU from simply being sold in countries outside this territory. Anything that threatened the single euro and the business as usual of these companies became a lobbying target. Another very powerful lobbying tactic that has been used by the toxic sector is to scaremonger decision makers, the media, and the public about the impacts of green regulations. They did it extensively over the original REACH regulation over 2 decades ago, and they have been doing it ever since. They have taken up the narrative that, alongside energy price hikes after the invasion of Ukraine, the REACH reform would lead to the de-industrialization of the EU. They decided to frame the debate on this crucial piece of legislation of health and environment as a burden of regulation. Of course, this industry does not dwell on the burden on communities and society of dealing with the rising costs of the toxic pollution crisis. Estimating just some of the health-related costs of European exposure to these and forever chemicals, the tally comes to between 52 and 84 billion euros every single year. These costs are all too real and are being borne by the public, not the toxic companies' balance sheets. In the previous episode of this series about how it took so long to ban a dangerous chemical that was present in baby food, we already discussed Plastics Europe and their tenacity that delayed the ban for more than 2 decades. Now we get an idea of their might when they work together with other lobby giants.
Lobby.
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 Big toxics.
Lobby.
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 Big toxics.
Lobby.
By now, you must be desperate to know what happened to the EU's promises of zero pollution, even if you can already kind of guess it. The toxic industry produced the so-called impact assessment, which they used to scare off decision makers and hook right-wing politicians. But we've shown in our research that it was such a biased study that it simply did not include the health and environmental benefits from green rules. This so-called study also diluted new components of the chemicals reform, like the essential use concept. The EPP and political groups further to the right were listening to industry and rose in opposition to anything Green Deal, calling for a general moratorium of its components, blocking the revision of REACH, and calling for a moratorium to the wider implementation of the Green Deal. Belgium Liberal Prime Minister Alexander De Croo and French Minister Emmanuel Macron also egged on the demand for a pause. A toxic combination of corporate lobbying, false narrative setting, cynical right-wing maneuvering, and growing influence of pro-industry forces inside the Commission kicked the REACH revision into the long grass of the next Commission, along with most Green Deal components. On what concerns the forever chemicals, 5 member states, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway and Sweden, have proposed an EU-level restriction that could be adapted by the European Commission later in 2024. Although an encouraging proposal, the industry lobby is already starting its engines, setting up its lobby vehicles, industry supply chains, and painting these deadly mortal substances as essential for the green economy and the digital transformation. There can be no doubt the toxic industry has known about the risk of PFAS for decades and have never done anything but expand production and commercialization, which has led to the massive pollution crisis we are in. Only one among the major PFAS producers, 3M, has committed to stop PFAS production by the end of 2025. The rest are not only pulling out all their stops in lobbying against regulation, but they are also already proposing opt-outs if there is a ban. They're always sowing the seeds of doubt over science for decision makers. Every day worsens the toxic pollution crisis and further weakens the EU's original ambitions. Every delay increases contamination in the present and guarantees more persistent pollution in the future. In the light of decades of damaging and even deadly products and components, it becomes hard to argue for compromises and agreements based on science. Industry and their allies always oppose rules, green and others, that require them to change and abandon their products. The toxic lobby has and will resort to any opportunity and all the tricks in the book to prevent a single inch of change from the business as usual, unless it's in the industry's favor. Health and environmental consequences of these hazardous substances demands urgent regulatory action. That is not possible with big toxics having a seat at the table and privileged access to decision-making. This shows the unequivocal need for toxic-free politics. We have come to the end of our episode. Please share it, rate it, and send us a message with your feedback. Text editing by Sarah Reeder, research by Vicky Khan and Nina Holland, script by João Camargo and myself. Sound design and editing by Gui Caligari, graphic design by José Torres. I'm Joana Louçã, and this was Corporate Europe Observatory, What's Going Wrong and How to Put It Right. Don't miss the next episode about how the gas industry got rich off the EU energy crisis.